So what I plan to do is just to talk a bit about what is 2020 for us, and why 20 miles an hour is important. Some lessons from elsewhere in the country, because things are happening all the time in terms of 20 miles an hour. And then we can have a discussion about what's going on in Suffolk and what next. So the organisation, for those of you who don't know, 2020 for us is we're a very small team. There's 5 of us, and we work part-time. And we support something like 700 campaigns almost now across the UK. And we have 2 functions really. One is to support those campaigns. So where a local community wants 20 miles an hour in their village or town, we support them and help them with advice and so on. And then we campaign at a national level to make 20 miles an hour the default speed rather than 30. And so that those are the sort of 2 functions. And about 28 million people now live in places in the UK where 20 miles an hour is the norm. So not quite half, but getting on that way. All the major cities and lots of places. We'll talk about some of those later on. Why is 20 miles an hour important? I'm not going to go through all these benefits now, but I'm very happy to talk to any of these points. I'm just going to concentrate on a few of the ones that I've highlighted there around casualty reductions and pollution is quite often talked about, whether it's a popular thing, and also what about the how does this sort of lower pollution thing and lower emissions also help to lower transport costs during a time when things are hard for a lot of people. So if you can imagine, please don't try this at home, but if you can imagine falling out of a first floor window, you will almost certainly survive. You might have bumps and bruises, and you might even break something, but you'll almost certainly survive. If you try the same thing out of a third floor window, you've got a much higher chance of not surviving. And you will almost certainly have some injuries. That's sort of the equivalent. That's like being hit at 20 miles an hour versus being hit at 30 miles an hour. That's a sort of relationship. And if you want to have a rule of thumb or a couple of rules of thumb, every 1 mile an hour slower in terms of mean speeds in an urban environment or in village centres will lead to about 6% fewer collisions. Clearly that'll vary a bit from place to place, but that rule of thumb is accepted by almost every road safety professional in the UK and in elsewhere. And it's I talked about the injuries you might suffer at different speeds. Depends, of course, on the type of person you are and how you land and so on. But actually, the 30 miles an hour is about 7 times the fatality risk for a pedestrian. So just when people think that 30 miles an hour is okay, well, actually, 20 miles an hour is much safer for people, for vulnerable road users, people who've not got a steel box around them. The pollution is often talked about, and there are really 2 aspects to this. Well, it's multiple aspects, but 2 in particular. One is noise, and I think we're increasingly understanding the impact of noise on our mental health. And that's becoming a greater focus on that these days. And if you hear a car going past you at 30 miles an hour, it's generating about twice as much noise as a car going at 20 miles an hour. And that's irrespective of whether it's an internal combustion engine or an electric vehicle, because it's a lot of the noise, particularly at lower speeds, is tyre wear. And so there's that with noise, and there's also a lot about both tailpipe emissions and tailpipe emissions in particular. The latest research shows that tailpipe emissions are about a third higher at 30 miles an hour compared with 20 miles an hour. That's in an urban setting where you're getting frequent stop-start. And the reason for this is that it's over twice the amount of energy needed to get to 30 than to get to 20. So of course, if you're getting to 30 and then you're braking, you're losing the benefit of all that increased energy, and that comes out in and that energy which you're consuming results in pollution from the tailpipe. EVs is also interesting because people say yes, but that changes when you have electric vehicles. Well, it does. You don't have the pollution at the tailpipe, but you're still having a bigger draw on the national grid. And you can see the chart on the right that's produced by Tesla. And what it's saying is the range that these two vehicles get, depending on different speeds at which you drive. So at a constant 20 for the Model S, you might get a range of 450. If you go at 50, you'll only get a range of 325. And that means you are drawing more power from the grid because you're using the same amount of power to go a shorter distance. So it's not just internal combustion engines which are being more using more energy. This is a summary of some work we've done on what we think would be the impact of having a 20-mile-an-hour default speed limit for England. We think we could see casualty reductions. So in other words, if all 30 miles an hour speed limits, or most 30-mile-an-hour speed limits became 20 miles an hour, we'd see a reduction in casualties of around 8,000. And you'd see a reduction in CO2 and NOx of between 26 and 28%. And we've calculated, there's a benefit calculator on our website, and we think that the investment cost would pay itself back in less than a year, less than 6 months, in fact. So there's a huge sort of cost benefit and casualty benefit of implementing 20 miles an hour. And that translates into not just saving your casualties and saving your emissions, it also saves money as well, because obviously if you're using less energy, then you're gonna have to fill up at the pumps less, or you're gonna have to charge your car less. And our calculation is that it's about a 10p a mile saving, and it makes, in terms of journey times, it's very little. Because again, most of the time in an urban setting, you're either speeding up or slowing down. So the actual times, I don't know if you've ever done a long journey and tried to go at maybe on motorways at 60 rather than 70, you end up taking almost exactly the same amount of time, but using much less fuel. And probably really importantly for councillors, particularly county councillors and so on, is that 20 miles an hour is really popular. Whenever we do these surveys, and they are done in sometimes very locally, in a village or a town, sometimes they're done at county level. This one here is from the National Travel Attitude Survey, which is done every couple of years, and they consistently ask what people think about 20 miles an hour in residential streets. And about 7 out of 10 people are in favour. There's a consistent but quite small minority who are against. That varies between 10 and 15%, and then the others are don't knows. So if you ask anybody, if you walk down your street and ask people what they think of 20 miles an hour, probably you get a similar picture to this. Maybe a few more, maybe a few less. So it is consistently popular. Interestingly, when you ask somebody what other people think, they often say that it's not so popular. The term is pluralistic ignorance, I'm told, but I'm not a psychologist, so I don't understand this stuff. What's going on elsewhere? Because there are lessons which can be drawn. So that's why 20 miles an hour is important for all those reasons I've given you. And what's happening elsewhere is that increasingly people are recognising what the issues are, and why we're getting increasing numbers of people implementing 20 miles an hour. Really, whether you start in the north of Scotland with the Highland Council, they're implementing 20 miles an hour across all of their 30-mile-an-hour streets, with some exceptions. And that's being used by the Scottish government to work out how they're going to implement 20 miles an hour across the country, across all of Scotland. They haven't. That's a manifesto commitment from the coalition there, and they will be rolling it out at some point. No date, as they're funding no date yet, but they're working it out based upon the information from the Highland Council. If you go to the other end of the United Kingdom, all the way down to Cornwall, again they are rolling out 20 miles an hour on all residential streets and town centres. And this was a manifesto commitment by the Conservatives in Cornwall. And when they got into power, they said, well, what actually should we do? And Philip Desmond, who was the portfolio holder for transport at the time, sort of wrote out to all the parish councils and said, do you want this? And he was staggered that I think all but one of the parish councils in Cornwall said, yes, please. So when you get the slides, you can click on this Vimeo link and you'll see him saying how amazed he was that the popularity of this policy. And Cornwall is pledging £3.8 million to roll it out across the whole county. So you can see that gives you some idea of what the costs are. Overall, it's relatively cheap. It's still a few million quid, but for the whole county, it's not too much. In Oxfordshire, they're expecting to implement 20 miles an hour on about 85% of their streets, and that program is ongoing, and you will see that in the press from time to time. And another village has gone 20 miles an hour, and again they're rolling that out across the county. So even in Gloucestershire, which has been a bit of a tough ask for the 2020 campaign, they've always rejected 20 miles an hour. But I noticed in their latest Vision Zero ambition, so that they have an ambition to have 0 fatalities or serious injuries on their roads by 2050. They're now saying that 20 miles an hour should be the right speed, really, particularly where vulnerable road users and vehicles mix. So even in Gloucestershire, we're getting some changes there. In Southampton, I had a conversation with the deputy leader of the council a couple of years ago. He was talking to me about whether they should implement 20 miles an hour on 1 or 2 streets. I said, well, have you thought about doing it across wide areas? Because it'd actually be much cheaper for you. He went back to his officers and they said, yes, that's right. And they've now come up with a program of rolling it out across the city. There's 13 districts, which they're doing it basically one by one, but they'll do that over the next couple of years. Surrey is doing something interesting, and this might be really relevant for Suffolk, is that they have lowered the speed limits on all of their rural roads. You'll be aware that the national speed limit is 60, even on the tiniest lane, unless a traffic regulation order has been put in place to lower the speed. And what they've done is they've reduced these roads to 50, 40, 30, and in some cases on some of the very smallest tracks down to 20. This headline is not correct with the picture. That will not be a 20-mile-an-hour road. That will probably be 40 or 50, I guess. So that's interesting for Surrey, but they've targeted the rural areas first. I expect them to do the urban areas as well in due course, but that's work in progress. West Sussex have also announced just last year, right at the end of last year, that they're going to support more 20 miles an hour. Again, another county which was very against, pretty similar situation to Suffolk actually, resisting 20 miles an hour everywhere, but they're now saying yes, let's do it. They haven't allocated funding for it. They're working out where they get the funding from, but that's still progress. And Hampshire, again, same situation. They were very against 20 miles an hour for a long time, and they're now starting to come round. This is 87 days. It's out of date now. I put this up at the last webinar. It's now 81 days. So we're getting ever closer to 20 miles an hour being the normal default speed limit in Wales, with 30 miles an hour as an exception where the local authorities determine that it's safe for vulnerable road users. So in Wales, if you go on holiday there this year, you will see a lot of 20 miles an hour actually, but you'll generally see 30 miles an hour still. If you go there next year, you'll discover that all those towns and villages, if you drive through them, assume that it will be 20 unless you see some signs which say 30. Clearly, the legal situation in Wales is different. Speed limits are delegated to Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales, and they can do it. They can do it themselves. We don't have that yet in England, but that is an objective for us. I thought I'd just talk a little bit about the experience of Scottish borders, not unlike Suffolk actually. Lots of little towns and villages, communities. They have rolled out 20 miles an hour across their entire council. So in all the communities on the Scottish borders, there's over 100 of these. They have rolled out 20 miles an hour. And the results have been very encouraging. This chart shows you across the x-axis, across the top there, you can see the pre-speeds. Those are the mean speeds recorded on each of those locations, and each of those dots represents a location in the Scottish borders. And you can see down the left-hand side, the vertical axis is the change in mean speed. Now, with the exception of one or two outliers, there's a pretty close correlation between the before speeds and the change in speeds. And what you can see is the faster the initial mean speed, the greater the reduction. So in other words, if the mean speeds are sort of 19 miles an hour, 20 or 21, you're not going to see a change. It's very unlikely to see any change in mean speeds. If your current speeds are 27, 28, 29, 30, then you will. There will still be some people exceeding those speed limit speeds, but you will see a reduction in a much bigger reduction in the mean speed. And that's a very close. You'll see it's a pretty tight correlation there. Looking at it in a different way, this chart shows the number of locations with at each speed bucket of 1 mile an hour, and you can see two things. The before speeds are all shown in red. So, for example, there, if you look at 22 miles an hour. You can see there were just over 40 places beforehand. There are now nearly 50. And you can see that not only have all the bars moved from right to left, so in other words, there's lower speeds generally, but they're also more tightly clustered. So the red bars are showing a range of sort of 19 up to 28 or so, 28, 29. The blue bars are showing a range of 19 up to about 24, 25. So you're getting two effects. One is a lower speed, lower mean speeds, and two is a tighter distribution of speeds so you have more consistency. And that's not really surprising, because if you have lower speeds across the whole communities, people will expect it in every place. In Edinburgh, as a result of rolling out 20 miles an hour across the city, they've seen crashes cut by a third since they did that. We typically say you could expect 20% fewer casualties. That's a conservative estimate. You in many places have seen more than that, but we don't like to be we like to be fairly conservative on how we estimate. So you can see that Edinburgh saw a bigger reduction in that. And that's because they included their faster roads, which also are the roads with more casualties typically. You typically don't get many casualties on the slower speed roads, on the slower residential and town centre streets. London, same thing, has seen a massive reduction in casualties arising from implementing 20 miles an hour on the arterial roads. So much of London, all the residential streets have been 20 miles an hour for a long time, but they've now introduced 20 miles an hour on the more major routes, and they're seeing a massive reduction in casualties, particularly for vulnerable road users. So here we come to what next, and really this is a discussion. It's a chance for you to ask questions about what I haven't said, and to chat about what we might do next. Gareth or Janet, did you want to just talk a bit about what you found in Alton?
Yeah, I'll let Gareth do that bit.
Hello, everybody. In Alton, we have a main street, Alton Street, in which we've had 20 mile an hour for 20 years. That was due to a campaign that was held 20 years ago because of a few serious accidents in the street. We're still, even though it's a B road, we're still a major thoroughway, simply because, of course, at the moment, there's only 2 bridges which cover, you know, that you can get through Lowestoft to Alton Broad. And if you take the Alton Broad route, then you come through Alton. Almost 2 years ago now, the county councillor decided that he would advocate the return to 30 miles an hour along Alton Street. So we started a campaign to keep Alton Street 20. As part of that campaign, we purchased a cheap monitoring device, which is in the bedroom window of one of the houses right in the middle of the street. And so we've been monitoring speeds on the road for that period of time. Now, this is actually the first 6 months of having the 20 mile an hour, the 20's plenty signs up along the street. And if you look at it carefully, the green graph at the bottom shows that in that period, the speed of traffic actually dropped by 7.61%. The 2 graphs at the top, the first one, the orange line, shows the percentage below the speed limit. And you can see that of 20 miles an hour. So as you can see that's gone up some 45.1%. So 45% of traffic were complying with the speed limit. While the lower graph, the yellow, shows the percentages at 24 miles an hour. That's because 24 miles an hour and a 20 mile an hour limit is if you're traveling at 24 mile or above, of course, it's deemed an offence. So and you can see that of that traffic, some nearly 30% is traveling below along at that speed. So the difference is about 15%. So what we would advocate is that you get, in our case, it costs, I don't know, £60 or something. It's gone up a bit now. Some sort of monitoring device, so you actually know what speed traffic is going at, rather than rely on getting data from the county council, etc., because you're in control of that data then. To start collecting data as evidence about you know, what it's like along a particular road or in your community.
I think the other thing to add, though, is that this is a result just of using what are the 20 plenty bin stickers. And actually there was a picture right at the beginning of Adrian's presentation, which is just down our street. And we used the bin stickers, but we put them onto wooden board. So they were double-sided, you know, facing both ways. And people just came and asked for those to have them in their garden. We were able to have a community sort of fund raise. So we were able to give them to people for free. because actually our community is a community where we've got really small terraced houses. People aren't super well off along where we are. So we wanted actually to make sure that people felt that they were able to do that. And this was just about signing, along with our very faded, I have to say at the moment, don't we all say that about our road lines everywhere, 20 mile an hour. We do have roundels on the road, but this was just an additional thing that caught the driver's eye.
Okay,
Thanks, Adrian.
So, questions. And we've got just maybe I'll just say briefly what we've. This is an example of things we've been doing elsewhere. We asked people to form local campaigns, and we've got quite a lot in Suffolk already, and we've got a county-wide campaign now going. So Janice and Gareth and Karen, who's also on the call today, have been helping to get a county-wide campaign going. Because if we can get consistency across the county, then it makes it, you get better compliance, and the county realises there is pressure. What else we've done in other counties is to get local parish and town councils to adopt a 20 mile an hour resolution, saying that they would like 20 miles an hour in their place, and asking the county, because Suffolk is not unique in this regard, asking the county to make it easier to get 20 miles an hour. At the moment, the process in Suffolk is a bit difficult because you have to jump over a series of hurdles, and really, in order to get 20 miles an hour in your community, you will need a change of policy at Suffolk County Council. So that's why part of the motion is to make us Suffolk County Council to make it effectively the default speed in towns and villages, so on most roads. Janet mentioned these bin stickers. There's one outside my house, and that these do work. These really do help. And we've also got banners available as well, which on our website, which you can purchase.